All right, let's dive right in. We are tackling one of the most world-changing and honestly, most chaotic periods in all of history, the age of what's called New Imperialism. We're going to see how this crazy dash for colonies didn't just repaint the world map, it kicked off a series of shockwaves, ripples that you and I are still feeling today. So, this is the big question we're going to unpack. This whole thing wasn't just about planting flags in some faraway land. What was really happening was the weaving of this incredibly fragile, interconnected global web. And the scary part? If you pulled on just one single thread, the whole thing could unravel. So what was the first thread that got pulled? Well, the engine behind this entire global land grab was the Industrial Revolution. Think about it. Factories in Europe are just pumping out goods like there's no tomorrow. But they're hungry. They're starving for raw materials. We're talking rubber from the Congo, cotton from India, oil from the Middle East. And they desperately needed new customers to sell all their stuff to. Colonies, they were the perfect answer. They provided both, which made having an empire feel less like a choice and more like a matter of national survival. And right there, that hunger for empire creates our first massive ripple effect. Because the competition for colonies overseas, it didn't stay overseas, no? It boomeranged right back to Europe, and suddenly, old neighbors were turning into bitter, paranoid rivals. This set off a super high-stakes game of diplomatic chess, where every single piece of territory, no matter how tiny or remote, became a symbol of national pride and power. Now, what's really fascinating is you can literally watch the temperature in Europe go up year by year. It starts out all polite and civilized with the Berlin Conference, where everyone sits down to draw up rules for how to carve up Africa without, starting a war with each other. But then, things get intense. The Fashoda crisis brings Britain and France, we're talking historic enemies, to the absolute brink of war over a railroad. But here's the twist. Instead of fighting, they realize they have a common rival they dislike even more. So they form an alliance. Then Germany, feeling left out, tries to bully them and test this new friendship in Morocco. But it just backfires completely. All it does is push Britain and France even closer together and basically draw a big line in the sand, splitting Europe into two opposing teams. And when you lay it out on a timeline like this, wow, it just clicks, doesn't it? These weren't just a few random diplomatic arguments. This was a clear, accelerating march towards disaster. You go from setting rules for the game in '85 to a near war in '98 to these rock-solid alliances by 1911. Every single crisis was like pouring another can of gasoline on the fire, creating that famous powder keg, just waiting for a single spark. Okay, so that was the political game. But the second ripple? This one was totally different. It happened inside people's heads. Back in Europe, the whole idea of empire sparked this massive, and I mean massive, debate. Was this a noble mission to go out and civilize the world? Or was it just a corrupt, violent land grab driven by pure greed? The soul of Europe was literally at war with itself over this question. And you can see the two sides of that argument laid out perfectly right here. On one side, you've got the critics. Guys like Jay Hobson were saying, hey, this whole thing is a scam. It only benefits a tiny handful of rich investors. Then you had Vladimir Lenin, who took it even further, basically calling it the final, most evil stage of capitalism. But on the other side, you had some really powerful voices. Nationalist groups like the Pan-German League were shouting that you had to have an empire to be a great nation. And then there was the popular idea of this civilizing mission. And a lot of people genuinely believed this, that Europeans were bringing medicine, progress, and order to the rest of the world. And this debate, it wasn't just some abstract intellectual argument. It got real, horrifyingly real, in a place called the Congo Free State. Now get this. This place wasn't even a colony of Belgium. It was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II. A journalist named Edmund Morel started this incredible campaign, using smuggled reports and absolutely shocking photographs to expose a system of pure slavery and torture, all to get rubber and ivory. For a public that really believed in the civilizing mission, seeing this stuff was a complete and utter shock to the system. And that feeling of public horror was captured perfectly by Joseph Conrad in his novel Heart of Darkness. See, Conrad had actually been there. He'd worked as a steamboat captain in the Congo, and it scarred him for life. His book was this brutal takedown of the whole civilizing mission idea. And its famous last words, the horror, they became this unforgettable summary of the moral decay that so many people now believed was at the very center of the whole imperial project. All right, now for our third ripple. And honestly, this might be the most important one of all. The people living in these colonized lands, they were not just passive victims, not at all. They weren't just standing around waiting for history to happen to them.
From the plains of India to the mountains of Ethiopia, they responded with unbelievable courage and creativity. They fought back, they adapted, and in some cases, they actually turned to the tools of the West against the colonizers themselves.
And their responses basically boiled down to two main strategies. On the one hand, you had direct, head-to-head military confrontation. Uprisings like the Sepoy Mutiny in India or the Boxer Rebellion in China were these massive violent attempts to just physically throw the foreigners out. But on the other hand, you had this different, maybe even smarter strategy: strategic modernization. Leaders in places like Japan and Ethiopia basically saw the writing on the wall. They made a calculated decision: if you can't beat them, join them. Let's beat the Europeans at their own game by adopting their technology and their tactics. And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of this military resistance, just look at this number: 40,000. That's how big the Zulu army was that rose up to defend their homeland from the British Empire. Now, ultimately, they were overwhelmed by industrial weapons like the machine gun, but that number, it represents an incredible, powerful will to fight for freedom, even when you're up against the mightiest superpower on the planet. But here's the thing. In the long run, it was that modernization strategy that really paid off. Japan's Meiji Restoration was so incredibly successful that it didn't just avoid being colonized, it turned Japan into an imperial power itself. And in Ethiopia, the king cleverly bought modern weapons from France and Russia and then used them to absolutely crush an Italian invasion. These victories sent shockwaves across the globe. They were proof that European domination was not a foregone conclusion. Okay, so let's pull all these threads, all these powerful ripples together now. The diplomatic chaos brewing in Europe, the moral crisis happening back home, and the fierce resistance erupting across the globe. These things didn't just happen at the same time. They were all connected. They fed into each other, creating this single global system of tension that was stretched to its absolute breaking point. So this right here is the crucial takeaway. The path to World War I was not an accident. It was a direct result of imperialism. Step 1, imperial rivalry created all the bad blood and mistrust. Step 2, all those crises we talked about hardened that mistrust into two hostile armed teams ready for a fight. And that meant that when a small regional conflict finally did spark in the Balkans in 1914, the entire global network of empires was primed to just explode. And that's what dragged the whole world into the Great War. And that leaves us with one final lingering question. The great European empires themselves, they've mostly vanished from the map. But the world they built, with its random borders that still spark conflicts, its economic imbalances, and its long, long historical memories, that world is very much still here. So the real question isn't just about what happened 100 years ago. It's about right now. How do those echoes of empire continue to ripple through our own world, our own politics, and our own conflicts today?